What do you think of when you think of endangered? There's talk, of course, about endangered animals and plants and whole ecosystems. My guest this week, Tim Brookes, invites us all to think about what happens to endangered alphabets that are then endangered languages, endangered cultures, endangered ways of people seeing. Tim Brookes is the author of many books, writings in New York Times Magazine, Atlantic Monthly, and over 100 other magazines, and a regular essayist for National Public Radio from 1989 to 2010. Tim has established a foundation to focus on the endangered lives of alphabets and the languages and cultures that they represent. Join me for this fascinating interview on this important topic that touches on all our lives globally. Enjoy this podcast with my guest, Tim Brookes.
Welcome to the It's About Language podcast, where language comes to life. Join your host, Norah Lulich-Jones, as she explores the fascinating world of language and how language is instrumental in the lives of individuals and communities around the world. Let's get into episode 118.
Well, you're in for an excellent and fun conversation today. I'm already excited about it. We've hardly gotten started. Hi, Tim Brookes. Welcome to It's About Language.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure ahead of time, and I'm eager to begin to share with listeners around the world some of the things that I've been indulging myself in and understanding about what you're doing, who you are, and the impact that you and the foundation are having on languages around the world. But one aspect of the timing of this podcast that I'd like to bring the attention to of listeners, that this podcast will also be referring to an event that is happening on January 23rd, 2024, and it will be World Endangered Writing Day. I'd like you to put that on your calendars. And Tim, you have said to me that even if someone is listening to this podcast or may have missed World Endangered Writing Day on January 23rd, 2024, that they can still access that information.
Yes, that's true. So they can get registration information and details about the upcoming event at endangeredwriting.world. Turns out that .world is a suffix we can now use. So endangeredwriting.world. So that's where you'll go for information, for registration, and that's where we will also give links to the recorded conversations, discussions, videos, etc., that are going to be happening throughout the day.
Wonderful news, wonderful news. Now, for those of you that are listening that do know Tim Brookes, that we're hearing the words endangered writing, or what I'm about to say about endangered alphabets, will make sense to you. But Tim, there are many new fans from this podcast, no doubt, that will be like, endangered alphabets? So could you tell us about yourself and about that phrase and how those are connected?
I think it's probably best to begin at the beginning, as they say. I do not have a background as a professional linguist or anthropologist. And it all started in 2009 when I was making Christmas presents. And I decided I would try carving signage for people, like shingles or signs that my various family members could hang up outside their door, their business, or whatever. And that went down well. And then I went through a phase of carving Chinese characters for everybody, like signature characters. So all of this was really my only training in wood carving. But I was having a great time doing it. And I ran out of people to carve things for. And I also thought, I'll try some kind of different language now. And when I had been in southern India on assignment for National Geographic, I had seen signs in Malayalam, which is the dominant language and script in the southern state of Kerala. And I found it fascinating because, like most people in the West, my knowledge of scripts is extremely narrow. I know the Latin alphabet, which we use. I can recognize Cyrillic, although I can't read it. I can recognize Chinese and Japanese. Everything else to me is new and exotic. And the Malayalam script looked to me like a series of elaborately bent paper clips. And I thought, maybe I'll try some carving in that. And I went to omniglot.com quite by chance. I just Googled Malayalam. And many of your listeners probably already know Omniglot, which is sort of like an online encyclopedia of the world's writing systems. And when I got there, I was sort of fascinated by several things. One was that there were so many scripts that I had never heard of. And I'm a fairly well-traveled person. And secondly, when I went to those pages, so many of them were, to my untrained eye, strange or exotic or really beautiful or just visually a surprise. The third thing was that in reading Simon's profiles, time and again, there would be these phrases no longer used for official purposes, no longer taught in schools, only used by a few priests, only used by map makers, only used by women to write secret love letters. And I thought this was sort of fascinating. And as an example of these scripts, on most cases, he puts Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, mostly because the UN has translated that into many, many different languages. And so that became my template. And I decided that I would try carving some of these two-sentence declarations in some of these scripts that were entirely new to me. And it was appallingly difficult, and I was woefully underskilled. But I thought, rather than quit, what I'm going to do is make sure that I can't quit. And so I set up an exhibition for about 14 months in the future, May 2010. And I said, this is what I'm going to do. And my students and my colleagues at Champlain College are also going to be invited to contribute to this exhibition. And so I couldn't let everybody down. It was like I was in it. And so I did, I think, 13 of these carvings, mostly in Vermont maple, because I felt that there was like a bridge between the carving would be a bridge between myself in Vermont and these other places around the world and these other people and cultures around the world. And when that first exhibition went up, people said two things to me that I wasn't expecting. One was, this is art. And I had sort of thought of it as being documentation or preservation. If I put something in wood, then it has some physicality to it. And then the other thing they said was, this is really important. You must keep doing this. And I had sort of seen it as being a kind of pre-senile monomania, like people who go off into their garages and they make scale models of Chartres Cathedral with matchsticks, But that's when it started coming home to me that this was actually something that other people saw as being worthwhile. And then subsequently, when I actually met people from these cultures that had endangered scripts and realized what it was like on the other side, then it was like, okay, this is your life's work. This is what you now have to do.
What a powerful and important statement of specific empowerment for individuals. You alluded to the fact that you began by using the two sentences that are part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah.
What are those sentences, and what is it that led you to those choices? How does that relate to your work, in fact?
So the two sentences, I may be misquoting slightly. This is from the founding of the UN right after World War II. And they are all peoples are alike in dignity and respect. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And several things struck me about that. One was that, many of these are endangered because people don't act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So this is actually the first really substantial point that I would like to make. Languages and scripts do not just die out. The way in which the narrative is often written is exactly the same as the way in which the extinction of species used to be written, namely that this animal died out, these birds died out. Invariably, the loss of a language or a script, obviously my focus, is the result of policy. It's the result of invasion. It's the possibly genocide, possibly economic invasion, where one culture finds that it cannot survive without taking on the guise of a more powerful culture nearby. Consequently, these really high-minded statements in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are really being violated. Even more so, much less well-known is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there is this declaration, which of course is signed by all member nations, that basically says that indigenous people have the right to name their own places, to use their own language and their own script if it exists, to maintain their own ceremonies, etc. And as far as I know, there is not a single country in the world that fulfills the spirit and letter of that declaration. So there's this saying that, linguistic rights are human rights, and that is absolutely true. And endangered scripts are always the sign of some kind of abrogation of human rights or some kind of violation of social and human justice.
When you say so clearly, linguistic rights are human rights, and with your work with National Geographic, you had named specifically, you have an essayist for several decades for NPR, you've written for The Atlantic and so forth. So you have all sorts of exposure to working with words and talking about what you experience in your travels and experiences. Help all to understand a little bit more in depth, a little bit more the urgency that you are speaking of here when you do speak of that linguistic justice is actually human justice.
Yes. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that because I had no background as a linguist or an anthropologist, when I started carving these pieces of text, I couldn't read them. So if you think about it, letters exist sort of in three dimensions. They exist in a phonetic dimension. We see a letter, and as long as we know what it is, we can assign a sound to it. They exist in a semantic dimension. So if we have a group of those sounds, it therefore has some kind of meaning to us. But it also has a graphic dimension, has a visual dimension. And because I didn't speak any of these languages and I couldn't read them, what I was looking at then was the writing as a visual phenomenon. And so I was asking myself, why, for example, this letter is shaped this way? Why this entire alphabet consists of variations on this particular shape? Why this particular script is so thin? Why this one is so geometric? So it turned out that I was asking questions that are not generally asked. In fact, David Crystal, whom many of your listeners will know about, he's like the David Attenborough of language. He said to me, you're the only person in the world who's studying script loss. And I was sort of looking around, who? There must surely be other people who are doing this that I can, read their books or whatever. And it's a an interesting gap in the middle of language study, that language study has been so specifically directed toward the study of spoken language. And I had sort of walked into or fallen into the hole in the middle of that. And there I was thinking, I am totally unqualified to do this, but on the other hand, it needs to be done. So I'm going to blunder my way around in here. And to answer your question more directly, when I had been working on the alphabets for about a year and a half, I was actually going for a completely different reason to Bangladesh. I was actually doing some public health work there. And before I left, I put the word out to, the internet at large. Are there any endangered alphabets in Bangladesh? And fortunately, a couple of people not only got back to me, but actually gave me some contacts. And so I arrive at Dhaka in the middle of the monsoon, which is an experience in itself. And I get visited by representatives of 3 ethnic groups who are indigenous groups living in the Chittagong hill tracts of southern, southeastern Bangladesh, who are essentially entirely marginalized and actually kind of disavowed by the government as a whole. So much so that there is no education that is delivered to them in their language. So when they first go to school, they don't understand what the teacher is saying. And the government's attitude then, and I think to some extent probably still is, we're doing them a favor by forcing them to learn our language. In terms of scripts, there were actually 2 or 3 scripts that were specific to these groups. But what was fascinating was that none of the people who visited me could write anything for me in them. I was going to say, I will carve something for you in your script. None of them could do it. One of them was actually a TV producer in Dhaka, a successful person, a Chakma, an ethnic Chakma, but he couldn't read and write Chakma because despite the fact that his father had been the greatest living Chakma writer and had the largest collection of Chakma books and manuscripts in their village, in the world, in his hut in their village. But the army had come in, killed his father, and burned the house down. And so he grew up not being able to read and write his own script. And I began to realize this is what it's like to be on the other side. And from then on, instead of being an exercise in curiosity and sort of intellectual adventure, it then became, the endangered alphabets really became an exercise in advocacy and in attempting to find all of these cultures, many of whom are very much off the radar, precisely because they are marginalized in this way. Most people in Bangladesh have no idea what's happening in the Chittagong hill tracts. And so the end of that particular story is I wound up working with somebody who became a good friend of mine who was from that area. And we created books and posters and rubber stamps and stuff so that the kids in a school that he had started in a ruined temple could learn their letters.
Therein lies a beginning of an answer to the question that was forming in my mind. You have this advocacy that you have been, that's arrived at your doorstep, as it were, because
Yes,
of your paying
yes.
attention. And how then, what steps are you taking? So here you're talking about having prepared books that current speakers can begin to learn more formally with the writing, spoken correspondence. Talk more about that, if you wish, and about some of the other steps that you are taking and that others might be participating in.
Yeah. So the first step was the carving. And I hadn't really thought about it when I started this, but when you have signage, especially when you have signage that is made with a certain degree of care or is unusual, then it has two qualities that are really valuable. One is that it's authoritative. So if you put a piece of writing up on a wall, the only stuff that goes up on a wall in terms of signage is stuff that is important, right? It's because the teacher or the local government administrator or whatever has to have approved it or even created it. And so for many of these kids to see their own writing, their own script up on the wall was new and inspiring, so much so that we had to get the headmaster of the school to take the sign down from his office and put it up in the school where the kids could see it. The other thing it does is that if it's regarded as art, then art and beauty have a very curious impact on people. They have the ability both to capture people's attention and also to, in a sense, elevate their sense of correspondence to that thing. And so it became a way of giving respect to the unrespected or disrespected or whatever. So the carving continues to this day. And I've done carvings for individuals. I've done carvings for organizations, for libraries, and many of them are on display in areas of the world where that carving essentially says, you belong. You have the right to a foothold on this earth. And that's one great difference between an endangered language and an endangered script. An endangered script, you can see it. It has that iconicity of being right there. So the second thing I did, as you say, was to start developing educational materials. I also had begun researching. So having found some of these scripts, I then became curious, like, what others are there? And at the time, I think Omniglot had something like 30 scripts that you could call threatened to some degree. And Simon has expanded the site a lot since then, but as it's become entirely my focus, I can now tell you there are more than 300 scripts currently to some degree in use in the world. And 90% of those, roughly, are to some degree threatened. And that is a significantly higher percentage than the percentage of threatened languages, although I don't want to make this a competition. But it's interesting that the effect of the endangered languages movement saying, one language dies every 2 weeks and we may lose half the world's languages by the end of this century was valuable. It was dramatic. It was immediate. What I'm trying to do is to say, and here's the other half of that statistic in terms of written scripts. After that, what I did was to start creating games. If you're going to revitalize a language, written or spoken, you pretty much have to start with children. And if you're going to start with children, you better have games they can play. And so I invented some card games and some board games. I've got a couple of different board games I've invented. And I invented a book of word search puzzles in endangered scripts. And I'm working on a book of Sudoku puzzles in endangered scripts. Because with Sudoku, as long as you have 9 different symbols, you're done. They could be letters, they could be numbers, whatever. And part of this, I have to say, is just because it's fun. And, you have to have something that in your day is like something is fun. But part of it also is very much from this sense that the hardest part of my job is to get people on the privileged side of the abyss of privilege to understand what it's like for those on the other side. it's routine. And I'm sure you know this very, very well, and your listeners do. It's routine to hear people say, oh, why can't everyone speak English? It'd be so much more convenient. And the answer is convenient for you, yes, right?
Yes.
But to get people to see why it is so vital for cultures that have their own script to be enabled to use it is it's very much of a challenge. And in particular, there is this weird math that has to get flipped around, where in academic circles, it's been very common to say there are very few users of that script, therefore we're not going to bother with it. And of course, what the Endangered Species Act has done and the Endangered Languages Movement has done is to say, whoa, reverse that. The fewer speakers there are, the more you ought to be concerned with it and researching it and helping sustain it, etc. And so really, a lot of the work that I do now actually is a kind of invisible online advocacy where I am connecting people around the world. Someone will say to me, I want some help digitizing my script. Or someone will say, I want to create a dictionary. And by now I have enough context to be able to say, so you need to talk to Craig Cornelius at Google. I will introduce the two of you to each other. That really happens literally every day.
What are some other partners that you work with, or those that are connected so intimately that you work with them on a regular basis? In case, or specifically because some of the listeners here may be reflecting on their own insights, their own experience, and will certainly want to connect up with you on endangeredalphabets.com, but also may be inspired by the kinds of connections that you already are working your magic with.
First of all, I appreciate the very professional sliding in of the URL right there, endangeredalphabets.com. It's easy enough to remember, yes. But I should also say endangeredalphabets.net is something that I'm especially proud of, which is the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets. So when I was giving talks, people would say to me, this is fascinating. This is like really, really significant. Where can I go to find out more about this? And the answer was, there isn't anywhere. And so in 2019, working with an intern, we put together an interactive atlas of about 100 scripts around the world with a sort of a profile and photographs and various links. And by the way, as part of the activities on World Endangered Writing Day on the 23rd of January, we are going to do this second wave launch of the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets, because in the intervening 4 or 5 years, I have found another 100 scripts, and I've written those up. And so those are going up as well. None of which answers your question.
That's quite all right. Yeah, I'm sure you will get there.
Yes. In the end, yes, we may all be very old and gray. Oh, wait a second. I already am by then. So other partners I work with, that's a very interesting question, because so few people, either on an individual basis or on an institutional basis, are doing this work. So, for example, I cannot understand why I haven't been contacted by a major university saying, the endangered alphabets, we want that. We want that on campus here. We want to be the only place in the world doing this. This is really significant. But that isn't happening. There is not a single course in higher education that I'm aware of that studies script loss, or even that is interested in the anthropology of writing systems in the way that I am. It's really completely missing. What this means is that there are individuals who are doing amazing work, although typically they work with individual communities or individual scripts. So, for example, there is a French anthropologist called Cécile Guillaume-Pey, who has done spectacular research in northeastern India into a culture that has created a spiritual alphabet that it worships, and that the way in which they connect with the immaterial world is by reciting this alphabet, each of which letters are the initial letters of one of the local animist spirits there, or some feature of their spiritual panorama. And Cecile has spent time with them and done great work with that. And then there's a guy called Piers Kelly, who's an Australian anthropologist. And I love Australian anthropologists because they just bust out of there and go all the way across the Pacific. And he very unusually has done a lot of research into newly created alphabets and writing systems. And so he's asking the question, why would a culture create its own script? And that is a phenomenally interesting and important question, which I devote at least 2 chapters in my book, Writing Beyond Writing, to, because it is so central to our understanding of what a script means to its people. We have difficulty understanding that because our script is used by everybody. The Latin alphabet is used by more people than all the other alphabets in the world, or all the other scripts in the world put together. And so our connection to it doesn't have anything like the intimacy or the profundity of scripts that are particular to an individual community. We understand a language. We say, oh, if you're Manx, or if you're Breton, or if you're Catalan, we understand your connection to your spoken language. We will wave the banner for you, but we don't understand scripts because, by and large, most people in the Western Hemisphere just use one.
Indeed, we do. And I'm thinking about the indigenous cultures here, even in North America, that were developing some scripts in order to be able to express if they had not already had them. And what a powerful cultural statement and stand that has been. I can only imagine how it appears across the world, as you have just shared.
Yes, exactly. And as a result, and this is one of the most remarkable findings of the research that I've done. So of those roughly 300 scripts that are to some extent in use in the world right now, 150 of them have been created by an individual or small group for their community. So next time you see one of those family trees that shows how the Indo-European scripts, spread across the world, what they don't show is that, in fact, even though those scripts are used by more people, there are more scripts that are not included on that tree than there are included on that tree.
Such a good reminder. And I even go back in that moment to repeat back that the attitude of, if there are few speakers or writers, then oh well, that shift that says, oh no, this is when we're about to lose the insights, the cultural history, the belief systems, even the attitudes towards the way that writing systems look and act in the world because of these loss of systems.
So I want to pick up on one very short word that you just said, which is we. So I just got a message through Twitter from a very bright, very well-read person who asked the question, what do we gain from these minority scripts? And I'm kind of going, it's not we, it's they, right? So you have to understand what it is. There is such an entrenched notion that we are in charge of the world and the world is there for us to exploit or to study, that it's not until you get to the other side of that abyss that I was talking about, where you kind of go, okay, So let's take a culture where the government has decided that it's more forward thinking to abandon the local traditional scripts and use the Latin alphabet. And that's a way of connecting us to the global market and the world, whatever, right? So within 2 generations, the only people who will still be able to read and write in that script will be elderly. And yet that script is the accumulated written record of that culture's history. And if you don't have that, you don't have that culture. You essentially become somebody who's imitating somebody richer or more powerful or more threatening nearby. And I'll give you a brilliant illustration of this. I got an email just when I was finishing up my work on Writing Beyond Writing from a young woman in Indonesia, actually in Java. I had asked her about the changes that were happening in Java in terms of beginning to reintroduce this traditional Javanese script, which is really beautiful and more interesting than I have time to go into now, and more interesting and rich than the Latin alphabet by several levels. And what she then went on to say was that she had found letters from, I think, her grandfather. And her grandfather had actually been a soldier in the Indonesian War of Independence. And she really wanted to be able to read these, not only to connect with him personally, but also to understand what it meant for her people to go through this extraordinary and dangerous upheaval. But she couldn't read them because they were written in the Javanese script. So her sense of herself as part of a continuum, as part of a culture, as part of a family, had been kind of cut off at the knees by the decision of the new Indonesian government to use the Latin alphabet throughout the 17,000 islands that constitute Indonesia, many of which have their own script. And that script, therefore, was automatically doomed as soon as that decision was made.
Well, thank you for the very rich catch of my small word and the implications of awareness, and for that excellent story. Can you share a story of an especially powerful recuperation of a script and what the impact has been in a person's life or in a group's life?
So World Endangered Writing Day is happening on January the 23rd for a very particular reason. It actually happens to be National Handwriting Day because I believe it's the birthday of John Hancock. But that was actually sort of invented by the pen and pencil industry to boost their sales. January the 23rd. Okay, so let's go back 250 years to northeastern India, to an area which is now the state of Manipur. So the Meitei people had their own script, and it was a very interesting script because one of the things that held them together was their particular religion, which focused on a particular deity, and each letter in the script corresponded to a body part of the deity. Now, this is not that unusual. Writing and sacredness and worship are very, very deeply rooted together. So a sort of a traveling priest converted the king to Hinduism. And the king's son ordered everything written in the Meitei Mayak script, which is this sort of sacred script that existed already, to be destroyed, to be burned. And so, we talk about book burnings, and it's an assault on content. Here, what you're talking about is an assault on culture and belief, and also on history. And from what we can tell of the only account that exists, this was a kind of not only cultural genocide, but spiritual genocide as well. It's self-inflicted. And so the Meitei-Maic script was not used for approximately 200 years. After World War II, you start getting, after World War II, something very interesting happens where the administrative divisions of India are based on language. They're based to some extent on geography, but they're also based on language. And all of a sudden, because there are over 1,000 languages in India and you don't have 1,000 administrative divisions or states, you get a lot of people starting to say, we are not represented in the state in which we live. The official language or the official script of this state is not ours. And you start getting a ferment of people who are either trying to create new scripts for themselves or to revive ancient scripts. And this ferment became so, how can I put it, intense, that there were people who were burning documents in Hindi, in the Devanagari script, because it didn't represent who they were. There was some civil disobedience going on, believe me. And in addition to this, there were scholars who were looking at this traditional script, which hadn't been used, for 2 centuries, and trying to update it so it met the needs of the contemporary spoken language. And eventually, the confluence of these forces meant that Meitei-Maic is now one of the official scripts of the state of Manipur. And January the 23rd is the day that has been observed as the day of the burning of the puyas. And the puyas are these sacred documents way back at the end of the 18th century. And that has been the commemoration day. And so I have rebranded it as the day that we're going to use to identify this turning of the tide and to give energy to the movement to rediscover one's cultural identity through writing.
Excellent. Thank you for that history. That was far more exciting and informative than I ever expected. And what a great, great story. There are so many things that are going to be going on during that day. There's actually sort of 3 areas which I'd at least like to have you start with. One is that you have with your website, both the endangeredalphabets.com and endangeredalphabets.net with that wonderful map. It's just phenomenal and so evocative. You have information. You also have, do you not, some of these games, some of these tools that you have been speaking of. You have your book, Writing Beyond Writing, that is your most recent, if I understand correctly, your most recent publication specifically about that and bringing in this linguistic rights and human rights along with many other interesting things. And then you have the day itself. Can you kind of provide a variety of places that people can go and experience these and more that you would share?
Well, I guess the first thing I have to say I would hope is that they don't visit me in hospital. Because essentially, I'm the sort of energizing force behind all of this. And if I am sick on January 23rd, who knows what's going to happen? So
we will bring in the good vibrations for you.
Thank you very much. So yes, endangeredwriting.world. That's where you can see, amongst other things, the schedule of events, talks, etc. during the day. And these are, I was sort of astounded that I made a bucket list of the people whom I wanted to invite, who really are either scholars who are absolutely eminent in their particular fields, such as Sabine Hyland, who is one of the great scholars of the Andean quipu, the knotted string system. Or they're members of the of communities that are working to revive their script. So the keynote speaker is my friend Mong New from the hill tracts of Bangladesh, whom I worked with and who founded this school, now these schools that are mother tongue schools for indigenous kids. So there's that schedule which you can go to and you can register for these talks. But there's also something else which I felt very strongly about, where this is a thankless task for the people who are doing this work in the field. And so I wanted an opportunity to recognize them. And even though I don't have any money, to give them some kind of award or certificate or whatever that says, look at what this person is doing. And so we have Professor Prasanna Shri, for example, from Andhra University in East India, who lives with what are called Advasi or indigenous groups and creates writing systems for them. And she's created about 20. We have someone like Christiane Kaboué, who does performance art and graffiti and all kinds of other things to energize the Baybayin script from his native Philippines. So, and then this amazing publishing company up in Nunavut called Inhabit Media that publishes children's books and adult books that are in English and in Inuktitut, and in many cases use the Inuktitut Canadian syllabics. So all of these are people who are doing just remarkable things that most people just don't know are happening. So part of my job then is to shine a spotlight on them. As you say, it's the relaunch of the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets at endangeredalphabets.net. It's the official publication date of Writing Beyond Writing. And yes, I would love it if people would stampede over to endangeredalphabets.com and you click on shop and the drop-down menu says Writing Beyond Writing. You go there. There's, and I think, to speak to your question really directly, what I'm hoping is that people will get in touch with me and say, you didn't do this. You forgot this. Did you not know that this is going on over here? Because all of the research we do is limited by the fact that we're working to understand the most marginalized people in the world who have the smallest internet footprint. And although we've done a lot of work and we've made a lot of good connections, I have probably discovered 4 scripts that I didn't know about since the beginning of December. And the stories behind them are always fascinating and often heartbreaking, precisely because, as I say in the book, an endangered alphabet is often the sign of a lost kingdom. It's the sign of a people who have been dispossessed in maybe slow, maybe fast, often brutal ways of their land, their identity, their status, their sense, as I said before, that they have a right to belong, on this earth.
I invite all of our listeners to stop for a moment and think about what is implied in the potential that you personally would be finding your culture, your beliefs, your history, your place on the planet threatened because you were not able to express yourself or pass that expression through to those in your community and your family and your inheritance through script, and to become sensitized to what's being spoken about here. Tim, what is the last thing that you would like to make sure that maybe I've asked about it and you wish to repeat? Or maybe there's something that's still on your heart that you didn't get a chance to express. What do you want to leave with the listeners here for the end of this podcast?
Well, I'm going to actually leave you with 2 phrases that I have coined and I use in Writing Beyond Writing. And I have to say they're kind of radical. And I make no apology for that. So the first is everybody knows the phrase history is written by the winners. So I've sort of extended it to history is written by the winners in the alphabet of the winners. So the history that you read is not everybody's history. And the history of most people has not been written. The second thing is throughout the 20th century, and actually even since before that, there was a kind of truism in academic circles that the Latin alphabet had become the world's alphabet because it was intrinsically superior, that it was the most evolved script. And this is total hogwash. And I say the only reason the Latin alphabet is the dominant alphabet in the world is because at various crucial junctures, it had more lawyers, guns, and money than somebody else.
Absolutely. The language, as we have said in other places, that language is dialect with an army, and that certainly happens with the script as well. Fascinating that what we assume about things and how you have raised our consciousness on this. Tim, I'm looking forward to the experience of your World Endangered Writing Day. Now, even more so that I know the very exciting history of it and your cute way of making sure that it's commemorated. I'm looking forward to the ongoing connections with what you're offering on the various sites, and especially to hearing more successes and more touched lives as individuals find their place on the planet, proof that they belong through the script that encapsulates their language. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with the listeners today.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for asking such great questions.
Take care, Tim.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this podcast with my guest, Tim Brookes. Please do go to my website, fluency.consulting, to learn more about Tim, the Endangered Writing Workshop, the Endangered Alphabets Project, about the Omniglot Map, about the gifts for purchase and the opportunities to donate and participate in this project that is such a matter of human rights, of public health, and in some countries, as Tim says so clearly, a matter of life and death. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to welcoming you for my next episode of It's About Language.